My sister-in-law showed up on a Tuesday with 2 suitcases and a casserole dish, and I thought she was just being kind. My husband had left for his rotation 3 weeks earlier. He works on an offshore oil rig 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off, and I had learned to manage those stretches alone. We had a system. He'd call every evening when the satellite connection cooperated. I'd send voice memos when it didn't, and we both knew that the hardest part wasn't the distance. It was the silence when something broke, and you had to fix it yourself. Our daughter was 11 months old that Tuesday. She had her father's forehead and his stubborn way of going quiet when something was wrong. I was still figuring out how to be a mother and a functioning adult at the same time. And when my sister-in-law knocked on the door holding a tuna noodle casserole and offering to stay a few days to help, I said yes before she finished the sentence. Her name is Tessa. She's 34, 2 years older than my husband, and she had always been pleasant to me in the careful way that people are pleasant when they haven't decided about you yet. We weren't close, but we weren't unfriendly. I thought her being there would make the next few weeks easier. The first sign was so small I dismissed it immediately. On her third day, she rearranged the kitchen. I came downstairs and found that every cabinet had been reorganized. Her logic, not mine. And when I asked about it, she said she was just trying to help, that she'd noticed I had trouble finding things when the baby was fussing. I laughed it off. Maybe she was right. I was tired. The second sign was the car. She borrowed it once to run errands and came back without asking if that was okay. Then she borrowed it again and again until I realized she had stopped asking altogether. When I brought it up, she said she'd been using it to pick up groceries and supplies, that I didn't need it since I was home with the baby anyway. Something in the way she said anyway made my stomach drop, but I let it go. My husband called that night and I almost told him. Almost. But he sounded tired in that specific offshore rig way, and I could hear something mechanical grinding in the background. And I thought, what is he going to do from out there? I'd handle it. I was handling it. I was not handling it. By week 3, she had moved her things from the guest room into the master bedroom. She told me the mattress in the guest room was too soft for her back. She said it with such reasonable certainty that I stood in the hallway holding my daughter and tried to remember if she had asked me. She hadn't. I moved my things to the guest room and told myself it was temporary. That same week, she put her name on my grocery account. She showed me the confirmation email like it was good news. She said she'd gotten a better rewards rate through her credit card, that we could split the bill more efficiently. I didn't even know she had access to my account. When I asked how she got in, she said she'd found the login saved on the shared laptop, said it just made sense. I called the bank and asked to change my password that afternoon. The next morning, she came to me with a hurt expression and asked why I didn't trust her. She said she had given up her apartment sublet to come help me, that she was sacrificing her own time, that she didn't understand why I was being like this. And somehow, I still can't explain it. I apologized to her. I apologized to her. What she said next, I have turned over in my mind 100 times since. She said, very quietly, that my husband would be disappointed to hear I was creating conflict while he was away. That he had specifically asked her to look after me because he was worried I wasn't coping well. That she didn't want to have to tell him things were rocky. I went still. I had never heard her say anything like that before. And it worked, which is the part that still makes me feel sick. I was so afraid of worrying him, so afraid of being the wife who fell apart while her husband was working, that I backed down. I thanked her for being there. I went and put my daughter down for her nap and sat on the floor of the nursery for 20 minutes just breathing. She started handling the mail. Just sorting it at first, leaving it on the counter. Then one day, I noticed a piece of mail that had already been opened, my credit card statement, and when I asked about it, she said she'd opened it by accident. It wasn't an accident, I know that now. At the time, I believed her because it was easier. The thing nobody tells you about a CEO takeover like this is that each step by itself seems survivable. You give up the kitchen and you're still fine. You give up the bedroom and you're still fine. You give up the car and the mail and the joint grocery account and you're still fine because you're focused on the baby. And the baby needs to eat and the baby doesn't care about any of it. And each time you think about fighting back, you remember what she said about your husband and you don't know if that's true and you're afraid to find out. She started controlling what I ate, not dramatically. She'd just buy food she liked and not restock what I asked for. The week I mentioned I was low on prenatal vitamins, she said she'd get them, and then she didn't. And when I asked again, she said she'd forgotten. And then she said she didn't know which kind I used. Eventually, I stopped mentioning things I needed. She monitored my phone calls too, in her way. She'd walk into whatever room I was in whenever I called my mom. She wouldn't leave. She'd pretend to be busy with something nearby, folding laundry that didn't need folding, wiping a counter that was already clean. I started calling my mom from the backyard, standing in the cold, keeping my voice low, and I still didn't tell her everything because I didn't have the words for it yet. How do you explain to someone that you've been slowly moved out of your own life? My husband and I talked every few days. She was always nearby when I called him. Always. If I tried to call from the bedroom, she'd knock 10 minutes in with something she needed, a question about the dishwasher, a thing the baby did that she just had to tell him, something that pulled him into the conversation and away from me. He adored her. He thought she was wonderful. She was wonderful to him. I had $80 in my personal checking account by the time I understood what was happening. Not because she had emptied it. She hadn't touched it directly. But because I'd been cut off from the grocery account. The shared household account was in my husband's name and she had access to that too by then. And I had no car to drive to a bank. Every time I thought about calling a cab, I talked myself out of spending the money. The mail was the thing that finally broke through. I found a credit card in my name that I had never opened. It was already 2 months old. There was a charge on it for almost $400 at a furniture store. I stood at the kitchen counter holding that envelope for a long time. My daughter was in her bouncy seat batting at a plastic giraffe. The house was quiet. Tessa had taken my car to pick up dinner. I took a photo of the card and the statement. I put them both back in the envelope and the envelope back in the stack, and I went and sat down and fed my daughter and didn't say a word. That was the last night I let myself be afraid of her. The next morning, I called my uncle while she was in the shower. He's an attorney. Not the kind of attorney who handles this sort of thing. He does corporate contracts, but he knows people, and he listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I was done, there was a pause, and then he said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't change anything. I'm calling someone today." He called a friend who is a consumer fraud attorney. She called me that afternoon from a number Tessa wouldn't recognize, and I walked to the end of the block to take the call with my daughter in the stroller. The attorney, her name is Cynthia, told me exactly what to do and exactly what to do and exactly what not to do. She said what I was describing was a pattern, not an accident. She said the credit card alone could be the basis for a fraud charge. I want to be honest about what it felt like to hear someone say that out loud. Not "you're overreacting," not "she's family," not "try to work it out." A professional, stranger, woman saying this is not okay, this is a pattern, and you have options. I stopped crying somewhere around the third block. Over the next 2 weeks, I did everything Cynthia told me. I got a PO box at the post office on the same walk I took every morning with the stroller. I had all my mail forwarded there. I opened a new bank account at a branch 2 miles away and had my paycheck. I do medical billing remotely. I had not stopped working through any of this, redirected to the new account. I got a prepaid phone that I kept in the stroller bag under the changing pad. I called my husband, not from that phone, from my regular phone in the backyard in the dark after Tessa had gone to sleep, and I told him everything. Everything. The kitchen, the bedroom, the car, the mail, the credit card, all of it. I talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He was quiet for most of it. At the end, he said her name very slowly, and then he said some other things I won't repeat here. And then he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." He had 4 days left on his rotation. We decided together that he would come home as scheduled, not early, because we didn't want her to know anything was coming. Cynthia had advised the same thing. We wanted documentation, and we wanted her in the house when it happened. My uncle drove down from Raleigh the afternoon before my husband came home. He parked around the corner. I had already texted him when Tessa left for her run. She ran every morning at 7, and he came in through the back door with the fraud attorney's paperwork and a locksmith. The locks were changed in 40 minutes. When Tessa came back from her run, she found her suitcases on the front porch and a letter from Cynthia's office explaining that she was not permitted to re-enter the property and that she was being formally notified of a pending fraud investigation related to unauthorized use of my personal credit and mail. She had a key that no longer worked. She stood on the porch and knocked for 10 minutes. I watched from the upstairs window holding my daughter and I did not open the door. She called my husband 14 times that afternoon. He didn't answer. She called their mother, who called my husband, who said he'd handle it. She texted me 43 messages ranging from apologetic to threatening. And every single one of them went straight to Cynthia's office because I had set up a forwarding rule. My husband came through the front door at 4:30 in the afternoon. He was still in his work clothes. He picked up our daughter and held her for a long time before he said anything. Then he looked at me and said he was sorry it had taken this long for him to understand. I told him it had taken me a long time too. We stood in our own kitchen and it felt like something that had been underwater finally coming up for air. The fraud investigation took 4 months. The credit card she opened in my name had just under $1,100 in charges. Furniture, a spa day, 2 months of a streaming service subscription. My attorney also found that she had attempted to add herself to my utility account, which I hadn't even known about. The charges were small enough that they might seem minor to someone on the outside. They did not feel minor to me. She was charged with identity theft and fraudulent use of financial information. Under North Carolina law, that's a Class G felony for the identity theft count and a Class H for the fraudulent account. She took a plea deal. 18 months probation, full restitution, and a record that will follow her for a long time. Brooke. Sorry, I mean her friend who had been passing her my husband's rotation schedule so she knew exactly when he'd be hard to reach. She cooperated with the investigation in exchange for not being charged. She's no longer someone either of us speaks to. Their mother called me once, about 2 months after everything. She said she hoped I was proud of myself. I told her I was, actually, and I meant it, and I ended the call. My daughter is almost 2 now. She's starting to string words together. This whole new language she's inventing for the world. My husband took a different position that keeps him closer to home. Shorter rotations, more weekends. We repainted the guest room. We got a dog. I think about the woman I was the night I found that credit card, standing at the kitchen counter, too afraid to breathe wrong. I want to tell her it's going to be okay. I want to tell her that calling for help is not the same as failing. That letting someone in does not mean letting them take over. That the people who try to make you feel small are counting on you believing that you are. The casserole was tuna noodle. I haven't made it since. Maybe someday. The tuna noodle casserole is still in the back of my mind sometimes. Not with anger anymore, just this quiet recognition of how something that looked like kindness can be the beginning of something else entirely. What Tessa did happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in small choices, one after another, each one easy to excuse. That's the part I've sat with the longest. Not her. I've spent very little time thinking about her since the probation papers were signed. What I've sat with is myself. Why I kept excusing things. Why I kept making her comfort more important than my own safety. Why I apologized to her when she was the one going through my main. I think the honest answer is that I confused endurance with strength. I thought getting through each day quietly was the same as handling it. It wasn't. Real strength, the kind that actually protects you and the people you love, requires you to be honest about what's happening, even when honesty feels like more trouble than it's worth. I wasn't honest with my husband. I wasn't honest with my mom. I was barely honest with myself, and in that silence, Tessa found all the room she needed. What I know now is that doing the right thing is really the easy thing. The night I found that credit card, the easy thing was to put it back in the envelope and convince myself there was an explanation. The right thing was to take a photo of it and call someone who could help. I almost didn't. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, and the only thing that moved me was thinking about my daughter in her bouncy seat, batting at that plastic giraffe, completely unaware. She deserved a mother who was going to fight for the life they were supposed to have. That's the thing about being a parent that nobody really prepares you for. You find courage you didn't know existed, but only when you stop making it about yourself. When I finally called my uncle, I wasn't doing it for me. I was doing it for her. And once I made that call, every step after, it got a little easier. Not easy. Easier. Cynthia, the attorney, told me once that the people she sees in situations like mine almost always waited too long because they were afraid of being wrong. Afraid of accusing someone of something they couldn't prove. I understand that fear. But I've come to believe that the moment you have enough evidence to ask a question, you owe it to yourself to ask it. Sitting on a question because you're afraid of the answer is not protection. It's just delay with extra suffering. My daughter says ours now, as in our house, our dog, our yard. She pats the doorframe when we come inside like she's greeting it. I watch her do that and I think about the version of me who almost let someone take this from us piece by piece. And I feel something that isn't quite anger and isn't quite sadness. It's more like a debt I paid in full that I should never have owed. The casserole was tuna noodle. One day I'll probably make it again and it'll just be dinner. We're almost there.